In this final video, we're going to look at the new color adjustment effects. So in the module library on the filter tab, you'll find the channel swap and the hue saturation in there. We're also going to look at the image switch module, which allows us to switch between images on the timeline, and as well as the lens flare and how to make your own custom lens flares. And finally, there's a few workflow enhancements that have been made to the network view, so we're going to look at those as well. In this scene, I've got a character and a background, and I'm going to put a hue saturation module in, plug it in underneath the character. And if we go back across to the camera view here, this is the OpenGL view, so I will render this. And he's in normal daylight colors here because I haven't changed anything in the hue saturation. So I'm just going to use the colorize section, which I find easier to use, and click on this color swatch at the bottom to open up the color picker. So by default, he has this desaturated red color, but if I put it onto something else, you can see that the character updates with that as I go, and I could change this to any color I wanted to colorize this character. So if I close that, you can see also that all these fields are animatable. We can create function curves for each of them. So if I create a function curve for the hue, I can animate that over my 60 frames, and in the second keyframe give it a value of about 24, somewhere down in the orange, and over time that value will animate. And if I render that, you can see that the character goes from this dark green through the yellow and into the orange. So the next thing we're going to look at is the channel swap. This one's fairly simple. It just swaps red, green, blue, and alpha channels for red, green, blue, alpha channels, and a few others. So if I go back to the camera view, just close that. In the properties panel, we've got the red, green, blue, and alpha channel, and each of these has a drop-down list containing red, green, blue, alpha, and some others. So this means we can swap these channels around, or we can turn them off or fully on, and replace them with other things. So let me turn the green channel off completely, full off, and all we're left with is red and blue, which makes this deep purple. And likewise, I can turn something full on, like this red channel. I'll turn that full on, and we've got a flaring out or a burning out of red. So this is just a matter of playing around with these channels and the combinations and finding what you need or what works for a particular scene. Okay, so let's go back to the network view here. I'm going to unplug the channel swap, and I'm going to show you the image switch. Now the image switch allows you to choose, I'll just drag it from the module library into the network and plug it in. The idea is that the image switch, you plug images, separate images in there, and then you can choose which one to show. So let's say I've worked on these colors, and I've got a hue saturation and a channel swap, and I want to show the first one for 20 frames and the second one for 40 frames. And let me just grab another one that I prepared earlier, a color override as well. So I'm running this character through 3 separate colors, and I want a keyframe. I want him to change from hue saturation, from channel swap to color override to hue saturation over time. So in the switch properties, we go back to here, you can see that channel swap is on at the moment, and that's because it's port index 0. I want to go back to the network and show you port 0 is on the far right, then port 1 is in the middle, and port 2 is on the left, and they go from 0 upwards as you go from right to left. So if I select back in the layer properties, if I animate this property here and I say that on frame 20 I want it to switch to port 1, then it will go on frame 20, this image will be shown, the color override. And so let me just switch over to the camera view and show you what that looks like. In the switch properties, I'll switch to port 1, and we can see that these are the colors I set up with the color override module, and that's the one that's being shown. So I'm going to create a function curve. On frame 1, it'll be on 0, so it'll be on that port. Then on frame 20, add a keyframe there and change this to port 1. And then we'll go along the timeline to frame 40, add another keyframe and change that value to 2, so we'll be on port 2. Let me just go to double view. You can see that as I scrub the timeline, we go from the channel swap module, and then at frame 20 it changes to the color override module, and I keep going along the timeline, and at frame 40 we're now using the hue saturation module. So that's really, really handy for, say a character walks into a room and he turns the light on and he's got dark colors and light colors. You could have let me just unplug these. You just plug the character in twice into the switch, and then into one you have the dark colors, and into the other one you have the light colors, and then you just choose the frame at which to switch from one to the other. And now let's talk about the new lens flare effect. This is a very simple scene I've got set up here. I've got a star field on a night sky and just some dark mountains at the bottom there, and I'm going to make a lens flare that goes across the scene. So if we go over to the module library, the lens flare is on the filters tab like everything else we've spoken about so far, and I'll take it out and plug it in on top of everything else. And I'm going to go back to, well, first of all, let's have a look at this module. We've got two peg inputs, the green inputs at the top, on the middle and on the right, and we've also got a drawing input. So we'll have a look at those in a sec, but for now let's have a look at the properties of the lens flare. This is a pre-built lens flare, and if I go to the properties of the lens flare, we see this is type 1 at the top. We've got a lot of tabs across the top, and we'll have a look at what those are in a sec. But you've got two pre-built types. You've got type 1, and if I go to type 2, you see this is the other pre-built one. Now the third type, or the first in the list, is the custom type, and I'm going to select that, and the other one disappears from the scene. I'll go back to OpenGL view, and now I'm going to add my own custom shapes to this lens flare by plugging a drawing layer into this top left port. But I have sneakily created my own flares previous to this, and I'm going to plug it in here now. And you can see that a layer of frames appears in the timeline, and I've got frames 1 to 10. I've drawn 10 different shapes, and you'll notice that the layer properties for the lens flare has 10 tabs for 10 different flares. So it's important that the drawings are numbered 1 to 10, because we'll be referencing those numbers in the layer properties. So go across to the X sheet, and you can see here that I did the second drawing. I swapped the second and first drawings. So I'm going to select those, right click and choose drawings, rename by frame, just so that every frame is labeled sequentially, every drawing is labeled sequentially, so that when it comes time to adjust the lens flares, I've got these: drawing 1 is in flare 1, drawing 2 is in flare 2, drawing 3 is in flare 3, drawing 4 is in flare 4, and so forth. Now let's have a look at my custom flare in the scene, and whoa, it looks crazy. What I would like to do is reset all the positions, because these that you see in the OpenGL view, they aren't the order that I drew them in. For example, this big rainbow shape is actually the second drawing in the list, so it shouldn't be appearing way down here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the positions. Well, I'm going to renumber the positions so that they all make sense. So drawing 1 is in position 0, that's up here already. drawing 2 is in position 2, which is way down here. So I'm going to put in 0.2, and it appears back up the top. Actually, I'll make that even closer, 0.1, and that appears up closer to the top of the flare. So flare 3 I want to put at 0.2. I'll move that across a bit further, 0.45. Flare 4, drawing 4, I want to put that at 0.75. I'll leave that where it is. Flare 5, 3, no, I'll put that at 1.2. And that's the blue one. Flare 6, so I'm just going through, putting them all in order of position so that they're all in a sensible order in the tabs. 1.4, flare 6, 1.5, 1.6, flare 8, 2, flare 9, 2.3, no, I'll make that 2.8, and flare 10, 2.9 right at the end. So now I think these are in the order that I want them. And now let's switch back to the network view, and I want to put a peg in the top right port. And I'm going to call this the swing peg. You'll see in a sec why I've done that, why I called it that. So swing peg, go back to the camera view, and with my move tool, if I now move this peg, it's swinging the effect around. So it's looking good. It's moving it all. That's the cool thing about lens flares in Harmony, is that all the movement, the proper movement, is set up for you. You only need to put your flare shapes in and attach a peg, and away you go. Before I go too much further, I'm going to reposition the pivot point right at the center so it makes a bit of sense. And one other cool thing about this is that you can keyframe this, the lens flare, and the second key back here. Okay, and we've got a trajectory that we can manipulate. So I'll put a pivot control point on the trajectory. I do have a lot of trouble with that word sometimes. And yes, I can play. Now, what is my? This looks pretty nasty. This this custom flare of mine. So what does it look like when it's rendered? Let's have a look. So there we go. These are the colors I actually worked on. I don't know why it's showing up so garishly in the OpenGL view. But in the render view, these are the colors that I worked on, and we've got a nice kind of rainbow halo kind of spectral thing, and it works quite well. So that's how to add your custom flare types. If we go back to the global tab just briefly, which is at the front, you've also got this brightness thing, and that is the glow that you see. So if I turn that off, you can see the glow has been turned off. So with that on, you can adjust the color of that. I can make it a red glow if I want to, or a bright green glow for a kind of Martian kind of ship lens flare, as well as the alpha and the intensity, which you can put over 100. You can go, let's say 120, and it gets even brighter. So you can even animate that value to flare as the lens flare gets strongest, or as it swings around. And one last thing before we move on is the peg. If we go back to the network view, the middle peg is for positioning. So you'll notice that the lens flare mostly pivots from the center of the screen. So if I go like this, it seems to be pivoting from around here somewhere. In fact, I noticed that if you have any of your flares positioned on position 1, that will be fixed at the center of the screen, and it's a little bit distracting, I think. So let me just demonstrate. Let's say flare 5 is currently on 1.2. If I put it on position 1, And now if I swing that peg around, you can see this middle flare just doesn't move anywhere. So I like to keep the position just slightly off position 1. Don't let it stay stuck in the middle of the screen. So back to the network view, I'm just going to add a peg into the middle, and I'll call this one position peg. So I've got the swing peg and the position peg, and the middle peg, if I go back to the camera view, and now I can move the whole flare around. So if I want it to be a low lens flare in the scene, say so that it's a rising sun or something and it comes up like this, I would use the position peg to have it low in the scene. And then and likewise I could have it high. So that's what the center peg is for. So next up, we're just going to have a look at the workflow enhancements in the network view. The new workflow enhancements for the network view make it easier to get around large networks. So up to now we've been getting around networks by the spacebar, and also with this navigator in the bottom corner you pan the frame around to get around the network faster. But they've added a new thing where if you hold down the Z key or the Z key, you can see this magnified preview. And this, wherever you pan around in that magnified preview, if you click, that will center the network for you on that section. So say if I want to go over here to this far group that's right on the edge, I just press Z and go over here and click, and there is the group centered in the thing for me. And that's really, really handy for getting around large networks. And there's a preference for this, the size of this preview window, this magnifying window. And if I go to the preferences with Control U, and I go to network, I've got this magnifier width multiple, so it's 5 out of 10, so it's half the size of the network. So by default it's on 3. I've actually put it up to 5, but now if I hold down the Z key, we can see the magnifier is a little bit smaller. And yes, once you get used to it, it's very quick to get around the network that way. Now the other thing that's been included is a linking function, which allows you to link things. If I want to link a module that's far away to the main scene composite, previously I'd have to select the module and then pan down while holding the cable and plug it into where I want it. But now all you need to do is click the output port of what you want to connect and then control click the module that you want to connect it to. So I just control click the composite and instantly it creates that connection. Something else you may have noticed in the previous videos is that whenever I go inside a group, we've now got this arrow here that we can get back outside the group with. Previously you would click that tiny little word top in the bottom left corner. So this new button is a bit more intuitive and easier to hit. Finally, before we wrap up this series, one last thing I think is worth a mention is spacebar panning in a timeline. We can now hold down spacebar and pan up and down and across the timeline, which I think I'm going to love as we get into really big projects with lots of layers and long scenes. And that wraps up this series. I hope you've enjoyed it and hope you've found it useful. See you later. It has been my privilege.